What's up everyone, Master Fox here today. Now before we get into the topic of discussion, let's clarify exactly what the meaning of Gatekeeper is that I will be going by. In essence, gatekeepers serve as a guardian, and in a way a limiting factor of what can go through them. Think of it like when you're at an amusement park as a kid, and the gatekeeper here in theory is basically a yardstick saying that if you're not this tall, you can't ride the rides. For those of you who have played League of Legends and heard of the legend of Gatekeeper Fabi, he served this role for those who try to get into Challenger tier. With this in mind, when we apply this concept to Yu-Gi-Oh!, we see that Gatekeeper decks are what determines whether decks that are on the verge or fence of being competitive can or cannot be in the metagame. Gatekeepers tend to prevent what could have been competitive from competing. They do this in a number of ways, but essentially the Gatekeeper decks are most often the weakest of the meta decks, meaning that of course, to be able to fight in the meta, you have to at least go toe-to-toe with the weakest deck. But this isn't always true. The Gatekeeper decks may also employ a strategy that many Rogue or Tier 2 decks struggle very much against. Let's take a look at one example from the past before we apply this idea to the current era. In 2012, Inzectors were, to me, a prime example of what a Gatekeeper deck is because they essentially kept out all Rogue decks from competing against the meta. They single-handedly protected the metagame from possible threats like Gravekeepers, which could have very well been quite decent given the myriad of the meta being fairly heavily Grave-based, with Chaos Dragons and Windups to an extent. Dino Rabbit didn't care so much, but still, the fact that Inzectors existed made any slower deck that heavily relied on back row to succeed entirely unplayable. If your deck could not play the Inzector matchup, you might as well have scrapped that deck idea because you would pretty much auto-lose in this matchup, and that's not the ideal for tournament success when your deck auto-loses to one of the big four meta decks. It was because of this that for the large part, Rogue was very rare in this era, with almost every single top being one of these top four decks. Inzectors in this case were obviously the yardstick from which you measured up your decks and gauged their level of competitiveness. Now, I know that there are many different Gatekeeper decks in theory, but there are others that are not so much. Like if you brought up March 2013, theoretically both Spellbooks and Dragon Rulers could be said to be Gatekeepers in a sense, but that's a little bit different. They are just the top dog, and as I explained, Gatekeepers are like the bouncers, saying you have to be this good to be able to hang with the tier 1s. Rulers and Spellbooks were too cool for anyone else to hang with them, and it's not like anything could have competed with them anyways, so it's very different than Gatekeepers. Looking at the current format, what would the Gatekeeper deck be? Well, it's none other than Monarchs. Monarchs nowadays are the limiting factor on what decks can be competitive in this metagame. They are essentially the key deck that decides whether a deck can hang with the big leagues or not. Add to this the fact that Monarchs are an incredibly cheap and widely available deck, and you've got yourself the best Gatekeeper the game has ever seen. The fact that it is so widespread means that you can't even luck out through a tournament and hope not to face them. It's almost guaranteed. It's highly unlikely that this would happen and is what makes them all the more menacing as a Gatekeeper. I want to take a look at a few examples of decks that might have been fairly competitive had it not been for the Gatekeeper's existence. The first example is near and dear to my heart and one that I know very well, Satellar Knights. Against Draco Pals, Cosmo, and even Burning Abyss, Satellar Knights don't really have a bad matchup, as they have cards that can basically single-handedly carry them through each of these matches. But against Monarchs, they have a really tough time. I mean, if you can get Anti-Spell Fragrance up on the first turn, you'll be at a huge advantage, but that's only a 33% chance of doing so, and add to that the fact that you have to do it on the first turn in the duel, and it's down to 17%. Not really reliable odds. On the other hand, they are facing down the hulking Gatekeeper that can easily set up the Dominion lock, which if you haven't played Satellar Knights is a crippling lock to face. Simply put, Satellar Knights cannot win without the extra deck, and Dominion cuts off this lifeblood. There are other reasons why Monarchs have such a strong matchup against Tellers as well though. Prime Monarch basically stops any sort of damage from Trigger plays. Even if you can get Trigger and Trigger bounce the whole field, when you try to poke for damage, if they have a Prime Monarch in the graveyard, they can just wall you off with its massive 2400 defense. All in all, a pretty terrible matchup for Tellers. Had it not been for Monarchs, I can almost guarantee you that you would have seen way more Satellar Knight decks this format. Let's move to another example from the Duelist Alliance era. A somewhat forgotten deck, I think that Yang Zings, both the Zephyra and Pure build, would have had a good time in this format had it not been for Monarchs once again. They have a very easy Cosmo matchup, as Cosmos basically rely on brute force to attack through your opponent's monsters, but Yang Zings actually really like that. They are able to plus and make plays off of being attacked, and so their Cosmo match is easy as cake. And for their Draco Pal matchup, it's not the greatest matchup in the world, but overall it's pretty even, maybe a slight advantage to Draco Pals due to their massive speed, but Zephyra Yang Zings especially can make menacing combos as well, and basically can make big fields just like Draco Pals can. But against Monarchs, they have a simply terrible matchup due to their slow speed and massive reliance on the opponent, which leads to their doom. Domain as a card once again seals this matchup up. There are many other decks that are not even close to the meta, but that terribly fear the Monarch matchup, making them nearly a gatekeeper for every kind of deck. Another deck that I've found to have a horrendous time against Monarchs is Despots. Not close to meta by a long shot, but the deck can easily steal wins even against the top tier like Cosmo and Draco Pals, but Monarchs absolutely crush them, and it's all due to one card, Majesty's Fiend. Monarchs just have so many different lock options that they can pick and choose from that no deck is truly invulnerable from their devastating lock plays, and add to this the fact that during siding they can side in many different types of locks for different matchups, and if the Monarch player is smart in using their tools, they can basically turn any matchup in their advantage, especially against these different rogue decks. Overall, Monarchs are what I believe to be the best Gatekeeper deck of this format, bottlenecking out several other potential competitive decks and forming probably the best Gatekeeper deck of all time. So that's pretty much it for this video. Tell me what you guys think in the comment section below. What do you guys think about Gatekeeper decks? Do you guys think Monarchs are a Gatekeeper deck? And what other decks might be Gatekeeper decks? Give this video a thumbs up and I will see you guys in my next video. Thank you.